Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Hargrove said when she asked about updating the pediatric ICU protocols. He said it the way most people say just before something that doesn't matter. She didn't flinch. She didn't correct him. She simply nodded and returned to Bay 3 where a 6-year-old's oxygen saturation was climbing steadily, the way it should, the way she'd anticipated it would because she'd already calculated the flow rate before the attending physician even ordered it. They didn't know her hands had held a dying child in Sangin while bullets tore through a clinic wall. They didn't know that a mute 8-year-old arriving in their unit in the next 6 minutes would remind her of exactly why she'd walked away from classified operations and into a place where people thanked you for saving lives. They were about to find out that some quiet people know more about survival than anyone in the room. The fluorescent lights hummed their tired industrial frequency above the pediatric ICU at Oak Creek Memorial, and Danielle Ross moved through the morning shift change with the kind of practiced invisibility that only comes from 3 years of being overlooked. She'd been on the unit since 6:53 a.m., 13 minutes early, as always, and she'd already checked the ventilator settings in Bay 4, restarted the 4 in Bay 1 that the night shift had positioned 3 millimeters too high, and restocked the crash cart with the precision of someone who understood that the difference between breathing and not breathing sometimes came down to seconds. Her scrubs were navy blue, a shade chosen specifically because it didn't catch the eye, and her name badge clipped to her pocket bore her full title, Danielle Ross, RN, BSN. Nothing else. No years of service ribbon, no unit commendation, no recognition of anything before 2001. At 6:52 a.m., she opened her locker, the one in the back corner of the break room, away from the main traffic pattern, and her hand moved directly to the object she touched every single morning before the shift truly began. The combat boots were caked with dust that had blown across Helmand Province 2 decades ago, dust that she'd never quite washed away because some things weren't meant to be cleaned. The leather was cracked now, the laces frayed, the soles worn down to the metal in 2 places. Sangin Valley lay embedded in the stitching. She let her scarred left hand rest on the boot for exactly 3 seconds, no more, no less, and then she locked the locker and replaced them with hospital shoes that squeaked slightly when she walked. That squeak would have gotten her killed in her previous life. In pediatrics, it announced her approach in a way that calmed frightened children. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and floor wax and the faint copper undertone of blood that no amount of cleaning could entirely erase. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms in rhythm with each other, creating a kind of terrible music that had become her baseline normal. She'd worked trauma, she'd worked CQ, she'd worked the kind of field stations where the equipment was held together with duct tape and prayers, but the pediatric unit was different. The monitors tracked smaller hearts. The 4 lines were thinner. The stakes felt heavier somehow, even though mathematically she understood that wasn't logical. A life was a life. Except when it was a child's life, and then the equation changed. She was charting in Bay 5 when she heard the radio click from the ED incoming. 8-year-old female, motor vehicle accident, unresponsive on scene, ETA 3 minutes. The way the dispatcher's voice flattened told her it was bad. She didn't look up from her charting, but her breathing slowed, controlled, measured, the way it had been trained to slow. Her left hand moved unconsciously to her left thigh where a scar ran lengthwise under her scrubs, a scar from shrapnel she'd never mentioned to occupational health. Her right hand continued writing vitals without hesitation. There was no tremor. There was no visible change in her posture. But her eyes moved to the clock, 7:09 a.m. Bay 2 was cleaned and prepped within 90 seconds. She worked with the respiratory therapist, a young man named Marcus who'd been on the unit for 8 months and still sometimes called her Miss Ross in a way that made her feel ancient, to set up the pediatric ventilator with the kind of efficiency that suggested choreography. Pressure settings. Tidal volumes. Sedation pumps primed and ready. She positioned the bear hugger warming blanket across the stretcher because hypothermia was one of the killers that people sometimes forgot about in trauma cases. She'd learned that lesson in a place she wasn't supposed to talk about. The stretcher arrived at 7:16 a.m. with the kind of controlled urgency that meant the child was alive but the timeline was tight. Major Chen's 8-year-old daughter. Admitted post-MVA. Glasgow coma scale of 8. Pupils reactive but sluggish. multiple contusions on the head and left side. The paramedics transferred her with the smooth practiced movements of people who'd done this 1,000 times, and Danielle stepped back with the kind of deference that had become her camouflage. She wasn't the attending. She wasn't the resident. She was just a nurse, which meant she could watch everything without anyone watching her back. The child weighed approximately 60 pounds. Danielle knew this before they'd put her on the scale because she'd learned to estimate weight the way other people estimated time. Her left hand made a note on the chart while her right hand adjusted the flow rate, not because anyone had asked her to, but because the physics of the situation demanded it. The child's BP was running low. Fluids needed to run faster. She did this thing where she made small adjustments without making them visible adjustments, the way water moves around stone. Most people never noticed. By 7:43 a.m., the neurologists had begun arriving. First Dr. Patterson, who'd been consulting on pediatric neuro cases at Oak Creek for 11 years and who had the kind of confidence that came from never being wrong. Then Dr. Alvarez from the medical school 3 miles away. Then Dr. Simonson from outside the hospital entirely, someone brought in specifically because he was considered the regional expert on pediatric traumatic brain injury. 3 of them stood around the bay examining CT scans and MRI results, their voices dropping into the register they used when they were discussing something irreversible. Danielle was changing the monitoring leads on Bay 3's patient, a routine task that required her to be present in a way that didn't require her to be noticed. Diffuse axonal injury, Dr. Patterson said. Bilateral subdural hematomas. The shearing pattern indicates significant impact to the temporal and parietal lobes. The contusions alone suggest loss of consciousness was immediate, Dr. Alvarez added. Likely hours before full neurological recovery, if at all. If at all, Dr. Simonson repeated, and that was when everyone understood that he meant if ever. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd said those words to too many parents. He paused, and then he said the thing that hung in the air like exhaust, there's nothing we can do for her except keep her comfortable. The damage is irreversible. I'd recommend discussing end-of-life options with the family. The room didn't go silent so much as it compressed. Danielle finished adjusting the leads. She moved to the next patient. She did not glance at Bay 2. She did not allow her jaw to clench, though it wanted to. She simply existed in a space with the kind of stillness that suggested she hadn't heard anything at all. But she had. At 8:09 a.m., she was standing at the supply cabinet when she heard Major Chen's voice from Bay 2. It was low and it was careful and it carried the kind of edge that came from trying very hard not to break. She didn't turn around. She continued counting packages of sterile gauze. But she was listening with the part of her brain that never really stopped listening, the part that had been trained to notice things like the number of exits in a room and the distance from the supply cabinet to the bay entrance and whether Major Chen was the type to collapse or the type to go into action mode. How long? He asked, and the question hung there like a fuse. Dr. Patterson explained about the scans. About the irreversible damage. About the fact that even if the child survived, and they were not optimistic on that front, she would not be the daughter he'd known. There would be no recovery, no comeback, no miracle. There would only be a body in a bed. Danielle selected exactly 16 gauze packages and placed them in the bin. Her movements were steady. Her breathing was steady. But she was seeing something that the 3 neurologists had not seen, something that existed in the space between science and observation, between protocol and the thing that came from having held the dying in places where there was no protocol. In the 6 seconds before the neurologists had begun their examination, when the child was still being prepped and the monitors were still being attached and the room was still in that state of organized chaos that preceded analysis, she'd seen the girl's eyes track something. Not consciously. Not with intention. But track. A flinch that suggested pain awareness. A pupil response that suggested more than just autonomic function. The neurologists had run their tests and seen what they expected to see. Danielle had stood in the background, charting, adjusting, existing as something less than visible, and she had seen something else entirely. She had seen the eyes of a child who had been terrified into silence by impact and fear, the same way she'd seen that look in the eyes of a 12-year-old girl in Sangin who'd stopped speaking after a drone strike destroyed her school. That girl had recovered. Not fully. Not all the way. But she had recovered enough to eventually whisper her sister's name, 3 weeks later, when she'd finally begun to believe that the bombing was over. The difference between irreversible and temporary was sometimes just invisible. At 9:41 a.m., Dr. Hargrove arrived on rounds with his entourage, a resident, 2 interns, and the kind of energy that suggested someone about to do something important. He moved through the unit the way a general moves through a battlefield, purposeful, assured, aware that people were watching because people were always watching. His white coat was pristine. His badge identified him as Chief of Pediatric Critical Care. His voice, when he began speaking, carried the baseline assumption that he was the smartest person in every room he occupied. "I've reviewed Dr. Patterson's assessment on the MVA arrival in Bay 2, he said, and the interns leaned in with the hunger of people trying to learn the baseline of competence. Irreversible neurological damage. The consensus from 3 independent consultants is clear: this patient is a futile case. We will maintain supportive care for the family's benefit, but let's be realistic about resource allocation. ICU beds are not unlimited. Length of stay metrics matter. We have patients with actual recovery potential in the other bays." Danielle was 2 feet away from him, adjusting the fall line on Bay 1. She didn't pause. She didn't change her expression. But she heard every word because people always showed you who they were when they didn't think you were listening. Dr. Hargrove had just told her, had told all of them, that some lives mattered more than others. That hope was inefficient. That a child who had been in the ICU for exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes was already using up resources that could be better spent. She finished adjusting the 4. She made a note on the chart. She moved to the next patient. And when Dr. Hargrove passed her in the hallway outside the unit, near the supply closet, away from witnesses, he said something so quietly that it might have been said to himself: "Some people don't understand that sentiment isn't medicine, Miss Ross. Wasting time on hopeless cases is a luxury we don't have." She didn't turn around. She didn't answer. She simply said, "Of course, Dr. Hargrove," in a voice so quiet and so compliant that he would never remember the moment had happened. But her left hand, the scarred one, pressed against her thigh where the shrapnel scar lived, and she was already making a calculation, the same kind of calculation she'd made 100 times before, about what was worth the risk and what wasn't. About whether some patients were actually irreversible, or whether they just needed someone who remembered how to see them differently. The communication board was laminated, nothing fancy, just picture cards with Velcro backing that Danielle had assembled during her lunch break on her own time. A cup. A fan. The word mom. She'd studied how civilians with aphasia responded to visual stimuli, how the brain could bypass damaged speech pathways through imagery, through symbols, through the kind of reaching that didn't require words. The Chen child's eyes tracked the images. Not reflexively. Deliberately. There was a mind behind those eyes, trapped but present, and Danielle had been building a bridge to it one card at a time, tucked into her scrub pocket during shifts that didn't officially include an authorized therapy. 3 days into this quiet work, Dr. Hargrove was reviewing the statistics board when Danielle mentioned it. Not bragging. Just reporting during morning rounds that the child had shown pupillary response to her father's voice, suggesting retained auditory processing. The attending physicians were present. The charge nurse was listening. It was a clinical observation, nothing more. Hargrove set down his pen with the deliberateness of a man placing a weapon. His voice dropped to the timbre of controlled fury. "Nurse Ross, when I need a medical opinion from someone whose job is to empty bedpans, I'll be sure to ask. Until then, stick to tasks that match your training." The attending physicians shifted. No one spoke. The silence that followed had weight, the kind of heavy air that precedes a storm. Danielle continued adjusting the child's oxygen tubing as if she hadn't heard him, but her jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, a single muscle flexing at the hinge of her lower face. That was all. That was always all. 2 days later, Hargrove found her with the communication board. She was in bed 7, working with the child during a shift when no resident was present, when the hallway was quiet except for the distant beep of monitors in other rooms. The child's small finger had moved toward the picture of water, and Danielle was already reaching for the cup when Hargrove appeared in the doorway like a door slamming open. He said nothing. Just stood there. Then he turned and walked away. She knew what that meant. 20 minutes later, his voice came over the unit phone. "Miss Ross. Bring your keys. We're having a conversation in bed 7. Now." Major Chen was still there, sitting in the plastic chair beside his daughter's bed, the way he sat every afternoon after his physical therapy sessions, the way military men sit when they're trying not to fall apart, spine rigid, hands clasped too tight. When Hargrove entered with Danielle behind him, the major stood automatically. Respect for rank, muscle memory, the kind of training that never leaves. Hargrove's voice was sharp enough to draw blood. "Miss Ross, and I do mean miss, since you clearly don't understand professional boundaries, has taken it upon herself to practice unauthorized therapy protocols without physician oversight, without proper credentials, and without regard for the medical guidelines that protect this institution from liability." He held up a formal write-up, already printed, already signed by him and the hospital administrator. 3 board-certified neurologists have determined that your daughter's condition is irreversible, Major. Yet this nurse seems to believe she knows better. The child didn't move. The machines breathed for her. The monitors continued their electronic pulse. "This ends now," Hargrove continued. "Any further unauthorized interventions will result in immediate termination and reporting to the Texas Board of Nursing. We are very clear on this policy." He turned to Danielle without waiting for response. "You'll sign this acknowledgement that you understand the protocols." She did. Her signature was steady, military precise, each letter formed with the kind of control that comes from signing forms in helicopters, in tents, in places where your handwriting might be the last record that anyone had been there. Then Hargrove walked to the public disciplinary board in the hallway, the one visible from the main nursing station, the one every staff member passed, and he posted her right up with the kind of deliberate care that made it a statement, a warning, a demonstration of power. The charge nurse who had trained Danielle looked at the paper and immediately found something urgent to do at the opposite end of the unit. That afternoon, in the break room, Danielle poured a cup of coffee that had been sitting since morning, the kind of bitter coffee that tastes like resignation. 2 nurses who usually sat with her during breaks appeared in the doorway, took one look at the chair where she sat, and simultaneously remembered they needed to restock supplies. The third checked her phone, made eye contact with someone across the room, anyone but Danielle, and left without saying a word. The table emptied within 90 seconds, the silence spreading like a stain. She sat alone. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed its monotonous hum, and outside the break room windows, the Houston afternoon was pressing against the glass like something trying to get in. Hargrove passed the doorway. He had timed it carefully, or perhaps he simply had the timing of a man who understood that cruelty was most effective when delivered as theater. He paused, made eye contact through the window. And his lips moved, his voice just loud enough for her to hear. "Some people don't understand their place." Danielle set down her cup with the kind of slowness that meant she was making a choice about what came next. She turned to look directly at him, and Hargrove's expression shifted slightly. He'd expected submission, the lowered gaze of a woman who'd been properly reminded of her station. Instead, she held his stare for exactly 3 seconds. One tear traced down her left cheek, precise as a compass point, following the contour of her bone. She didn't look away. She reached up and wiped it without breaking eye contact, and her voice emerged low and steady, the voice of someone speaking from a depth he couldn't fathom. "I understand my place better than you'll ever know." He smirked. The kind of smirk that meant he'd won, that her defiance was exactly the proof of insubordination he'd needed. He turned and walked away, and she sat back down in the empty break room and didn't move until her shift ended. That evening, in the locker room, she opened her personal locker and stared at the combat boots for a full minute, 60 seconds that felt like a threshold. They were caked with dust from a valley that no longer existed, or existed in a different way now, buried deep enough that the operation had been declassified and then reclassified and then compartmentalized beyond the reach of any normal record. She could see herself in the polished stainless steel of her locker door, and she barely recognized the woman looking back. Danielle Ross, pediatric nurse. Danielle Ross, just someone who didn't understand her place. She closed the locker without removing the boots and drove home through Houston traffic as the sun dropped behind the skyline like something going down in flames. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had spent 20 years building this identity, this invisibility, this perfect performance of being small enough to disappear, and in exactly 4 days, she would make a choice that would explode that entire architecture. A choice that would shatter the careful distance between the person she was supposed to be and the person she actually was. A choice that would bring everything buried for 2 decades up through the earth like a resurrection she hadn't asked for. And she would make that choice because some things, when you saw them clearly, you couldn't unsee. Some patients weren't actually irreversible. Some people just needed someone who remembered how to see them differently. Someone who understood that sometimes the rules that were supposed to protect you were actually designed to bind you, to keep you small, to keep you in your place. The combat boots would stay in the locker for 3 more days. After that, they would have a completely different meaning. 3 days passed like water draining through a closed fist. Danielle worked the night shift at Oak Creek Memorial, moving through the pediatric ICU with the same invisible efficiency she'd perfected over 17 years, checking monitors, adjusting medications, documenting vitals in the electronic system with a precision that left no room for error. She spoke only when necessary. The other nurses stopped greeting her in the break room. Someone had removed her name from the call rotation for the unit's annual dinner. The disciplinary notice still hung on the public board, laminated and impossible to miss, though she never looked at it directly. Around midnight on the 3rd day, she stood at the medication dispensary, verifying a dose of acetaminophen for bed 4, when her muscles tensed the way they hadn't tensed in 20 years, a recognition, primitive and certain, that something was about to break. At 02:47 hours, the monitors in bed 7 began their urgent song. The child. Major Chen's daughter. The one Hargrove had declared irreversible. The oxygen saturation alarm screamed first, a high-pitched electronic shriek that severed the quiet of the night shift. Danielle was already moving, her feet crossing the 12 feet to bed 7 before her conscious mind finished processing the number on the screen, 86% and falling. 82. 79. The monitor's rhythm became its own kind of language, and her hands moved through the assessment with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had performed this same calculation 1,000 times on 1,000 different bodies, some of them bleeding out in the rubble of a clinic in Helmand Province, others choking on their own fluid in the dark. The child's neck veins bulged like ropes pulled taut. Tracheal deviation. The chest wall moved asymmetrically, the left side barely rising with each desperate breath. A tension pneumothorax. Air trapped between the lung and chest wall, collapsing the entire left side, pressing against the heart, kinking the vena cava. Every second the pressure built, the child was closer to cardiac arrest. Danielle's hands found the call button and activated the code overhead. Medical team, bed 7. Now. Her voice was level, untethered from panic. She was already pulling the cart with emergency equipment, the metal wheels squeaking against the linoleum tile like small animals crying out. The pediatric ICU came alive. Monitors beeped in synchronous confusion. Nurses emerged from other rooms, their movements purposeful but measured. This was protocol, this was the choreography they practiced quarterly during drills. But no doctor arrived. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Danielle ran the initial interventions, oxygen elevated to 15 liters per minute through a non-rebreather mask, positioning the child upright, running a rapid assessment of lung sounds that confirmed what the physical exam had already announced, silence on the left. Complete lung collapse. The child's oxygen saturation had become an equation in free fall. 71. 68. The machine was no longer simply alarming, it was screaming. A registered nurse named Chambers arrived and stood at the foot of the bed, looking toward the hallway with widening eyes. "Where's the attending?" Danielle didn't answer. She was already reaching for the emergency equipment cart, her fingers moving through the organized compartments with the kind of muscle memory that belonged to someone else, to a person who had carried different titles and walked different continents. 3 minutes. Still no attending physician. The child's lips were turning grey. Fingernail beds dulling from pink to a color that resembled old clay. The monitor showed a heart rate of 142, climbing, the physiologic scream of a body being asphyxiated from the inside. Every cell searching for oxygen that couldn't reach it because the pressure in the chest cavity was now higher than the pressure trying to push air into the lungs. The child would arrest within 90 seconds. Danielle's hand moved to the crash cart where the needle decompression kit lay sealed and untouched. Chambers stepped forward. "We need a doctor for that." The voice came from somewhere far away, important and correct and entirely irrelevant to the mathematics of survival happening 3 feet away. Danielle didn't look at her. She was already performing the mental calculation, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, through the chest wall, through the pleural space, the needle angled slightly cranial to avoid the rib below. Pain is data. Data is survival. She'd learned that lesson in a place where there were no attending physicians, only people who understood that hesitation was a form of murder. She tore open the sterile field. 14-gauge angiocath needle. The skin was small, a child's ribs only centimeters apart, but the physiology was identical. She didn't sterilize the site with the standard chlorhexidine prep, there was no time. She used the alcohol swab from her pocket, 30 seconds of pressure, muscle memory that had taught her efficiency was more important than protocol when the only alternative was a corpse. The child's oxygen saturation read 58. Danielle positioned her left hand along the third rib, landmark, reference point. The architecture of the human frame burned into neural pathways that no civilian job could erase. Her right hand held the needle at a 45-degree angle. She didn't hesitate. She didn't take a breath. She didn't do any of the things that hesitant people do. She moved the way the universe moves when it's running out of time. The needle pierced the skin. Muscle. The thin membrane of the pleura. Then came the sound. The hiss of air escaping. A rush like a pressure valve releasing, like the world sighing with relief, like survival recognizing itself. The monitor chimed immediately. The oxygen saturation began its climb. 61. 65. 70. The change was instantaneous because the physiology was that simple: remove the pressure, let the lung re-expand, give the heart room to beat. 74. 78. The child's color returned in the way that color returns to the dying when they've been snatched back from the mathematics of collapse. The attending physician appeared in the doorway at exactly that moment, moving with the distracted urgency of someone who'd been interrupted from something important. Behind him stood a night shift resident, pale and apologetic for the delay. They'd been in the NICU 2 floors down. There had been a delivery complication. By the time the overhead announcement reached them, by the time they'd processed the information and moved their bodies across the hospital floor, the crisis had already ended. The attending took in the scene, the child breathing steadily, the oxygen saturation now at 84% and rising, the needle decompression kit open beside the bed, Danielle's hand still positioned at the second intercostal space. For a moment, nobody spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song, indifferent to violations and protocols and the hospital's risk management policies. Who performed the procedure? The attending's voice was administrative, not accusatory, but the question itself was a sealed envelope containing consequences. Danielle withdrew the needle, and her hands moved to the child's wrist, taking a pulse that was now strong enough to count, 104 beats per minute, elevated but no longer catastrophic, the rhythm that meant the heart had room to work again. She had no idea where this next moment would lead her. She had no idea that everything she'd buried 17 years ago was about to surface with the force of something that couldn't be kept underwater. She only knew that the child was breathing. That Major Chen's daughter had a heartbeat. That oxygen was climbing. I did. She stood, leaving the question and all its implications behind her like something she'd already decided to carry. She didn't look at the attending. She didn't look at Chambers. She looked at the monitor, at the waveform that meant the child would live, at the numbers that spelled survival, and she said the only thing that mattered in that moment: she's stable. The moment the monitor showed sinus rhythm, the moment oxygen climbed to 94, the pediatric ICU should have erupted in relief. Instead, it held its breath. Danielle stepped back from the bedside, her gloved hand still steady, her face neutral as surgical steel, and that's when Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway. He didn't say thank you. He said her name like it tasted like rust. Danielle. My office. Now. She stripped the gloves, dropped them in the red hazard bin, and followed him through the unit. Every nurse pretended not to watch. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical indifference. By the time she closed his office door, she already knew what was coming. You performed a procedure you are not credentialed to perform. His voice was quiet, which made it worse. Quiet voices held conviction. You violated standing orders. You bypassed physician supervision. You endangered that child. She didn't respond. Responses gave him ammunition. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation. Security will escort you from the building within the hour. You'll surrender your badge and access credentials. He opened a drawer, removed a single sheet of paper, and slid it across the desk. Suspension notice. Already typed. Already signed. He'd prepared it before even entering her patient's room. HR will contact you within 5 business days regarding termination proceedings. Danielle picked up the notice. The paper was still warm from the printer. She read it once, folded it once, and placed it on his desk. I understand, Doctor. The formality of it, the absolute absence of emotion, made his jaw tighten. He'd expected tears or anger or a defense. What he got was compliance so complete it felt like a weapon. What he didn't know was that she'd already begun severing the tether between her civilian life and everything before it. By 08:15 hours the next morning, Dr. Hargrove had made 4 phone calls. The first was to Thomas Brennan, hospital board member and venture capitalist who owed Hargrove a favor from a divorce that never went public. The second was to Patricia Olmsted, chief medical officer at Hermann Memorial, a colleague from his fellowship years who'd helped him land the Oak Creek position. The third was to Gerald Finch, an outside investigator who specialized in healthcare fraud cases and had connections in federal law enforcement databases. The fourth was to a private firm that specialized in background investigations, the kind that could pull records from sealed files if you knew the right people and had enough budget. Within 6 hours, Hargrove had 3 board members primed to support a termination, a CMO willing to advise on severance negotiations that favored the hospital, and 2 separate investigators with standing orders to examine Danielle Ross's employment history for inconsistencies. The sparse references she'd listed: a clinic in San Diego closed in 2001, a humanitarian organization that no longer existed, a training facility in Virginia with no forwarding records, were already flagged as suspicious. The gap between 1998 and 2002 in her official documentation was enormous. No jobs listed. No addresses. No explanation. To anyone looking, it looked like fraud. Hargrove had weaponized her own secrecy against her. At 1,340 hours, 2 uniformed security officers appeared at Danielle's apartment in the Montrose district. They were professional but efficient. She handed them her badge without being asked. She emptied her locker, a few scrubs she'd left, a water bottle, a paperback novel she'd been reading since March. And the combat boots. She'd kept them there for 3 years, touching them every shift like they were a talisman. She wrapped them in a surgical drape and placed them in a canvas bag. The officer watched her do this with the neutral expression of someone who'd seen worse transitions. "Will you be able to reach me?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "Hospitals already sent termination notice to your home address. HR will contact you about final paperwork." He didn't add anything else. He didn't need to. The walk to her truck took 43 seconds. The drive home took 17 minutes. She didn't put on music. She didn't check her phone. She drove with both hands on the wheel and her eyes tracking the other vehicles like she was reading tactical positions, which car could accelerate, which one was being piloted by someone paying attention, which was a threat. At 18:47 hours, her 12-year-old son found her at their kitchen table. The house was dark. She'd been sitting there for 3 hours, the combat boots in their canvas bag beside her, her hands wrapped around a cold coffee cup. The light from the open refrigerator spilled across her face. "Mom." His voice cracked the way 12-year-old voices do, caught between childhood and whatever came next. "Why are you home?" She couldn't answer him. Not with the truth. The truth lived in a locked box labeled classified, and she'd spent 2 decades making sure that box stayed sealed. Her son had a social security number and a birth certificate and a school roster, but he had no idea who his mother actually was. He thought she was someone who bandaged children and adjusted ventilators and came home tired from a job that mattered but wasn't dangerous. "They're letting me have some time off," she said, and the lie tasted like copper. "Did something bad happen?" He sat down across from her, and his eyes, her eyes, the color of storm water, were too perceptive for any child's face. She looked at the combat boots in their canvas bag. The leather was cracked. The laces were military-issue tan, frayed at the edges. Sangin dust still clung to the heel, a fine tan powder that no amount of cleaning could remove because she'd never tried. Those boots had walked through a clinic while rounds came through the walls. Those boots had stepped over spent shell casings. Those boots had carried her through the worst hours of her life, and she'd kept them because they were the only proof that those hours had been real. "It's complicated," she whispered. Her son reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm, and his grip was strong, and he said nothing, which was exactly what she needed him to say. In that moment, sitting in the dark kitchen with the cold coffee and the weight of 20 years pressing down on her shoulders, Danielle Ross had no words that could explain the war she'd been fighting in silence. The question wasn't whether she'd survived this. She'd survived worse. The question was whether she could survive it without revealing the one truth that would change everything about how her son understood his own mother. She squeezed his hand and said the only thing she could, "I love you." He nodded, like he understood that some answers weren't allowed in peacetime, and stayed with her until the dark softened toward dawn. The morning before the termination hearing, the ICU monitor in Bay 7 registered a new admission. The alert came through at 6:47 a.m., and Danielle was 3 floors away, sitting in the hospital cafeteria with her hands wrapped around a coffee she couldn't taste. The message on her pager made her look up. Stroke patient. Age 53. No name yet, just a room assignment and a Pashto interpreter request. She didn't think much of it. Houston received patients from everywhere. But when she walked past the bay 20 minutes later, something in her chest stopped. The man in the bed had the color of weathered leather and eyes that moved too fast, scanning the room like he was calculating sight lines. His right side was slack from the stroke, but his left hand gripped the bed rail with the intensity of someone accustomed to holding onto things while everything fell apart. When his gaze locked onto Danielle standing in the doorway, his body went rigid. The monitors accelerated. His mouth opened, and Pashto came out in a torrent, not anger, but something that sounded like recognition. The interpreter, a woman named Layla who worked contract shifts, was translating before Danielle could move. "He says he knows you." "He says," Layla's voice faltered. "He says you held his son while bullets came through. He says you were singing to keep the boy calm. He says your hands had scars from shrapnel and your voice sounded like iron." The room tilted. Danielle's hand found the doorframe. It was 2003. Sangin Valley. A clinic, if you could call it that, 2 concrete rooms and a generator that didn't work. Danielle had been there for 4 hours after a raid went sideways, working with field bandages and her own blood mixed with someone else's because the triage line had no end. A boy came through the door carrying his younger brother. 8 years old. 10 years old. Danielle couldn't remember which was which anymore, but she remembered the hole in the youngest one's abdomen and the rattle in his chest that meant blood was filling the space where air should be. She remembered singing because silence made the boy's eyes bigger, made the fear louder than the artillery outside. She remembered his father watching from the corner, understanding that his child was already dead but hoping that somehow American hands and American will could negotiate with a physics that didn't negotiate. The father in Bay 7 was crying. His words came faster, more desperate, his stroke slowed mouth fighting to form the sounds he needed to make. The monitors screamed. His heart rate climbed past 120. "He's asking if you remember," Layla whispered. "He says his other son lived because you gave him blood. He says he became a policeman because of you. He says he wants to thank you and apologize because he was working for the wrong side then." Danielle stepped into the room. She didn't feel the motion. Her body moved without consulting her brain. She took the man's left hand, the functional one, and she held it steady, and she said the only thing that could cross the distance between that shattered clinic and this Houston ICU 6,000 miles and 20 years later, "Your son is safe now." The man broke. His body heaved. A monitor wire fell. Alarm sang. But his eyes locked onto hers with the intensity of someone who had finally found something he'd spent 2 decades searching for, and in that moment, Danielle understood that some wars never really end, they just change zip codes. The movement in the hallway came first. Major Chen's voice. Then the sound of sneakers on tile, moving fast, and Danielle turned to see the child, Major Chen's daughter, standing in her doorway using a walker, standing upright for the first time in the 17 days since her accident. Her mother was 2 steps behind, one hand covering her mouth. The girl's eyes moved between her father and the Afghan man in the bed. Something in the room shifted. Something in the girl's neural pathways, dormant for 17 days, found a connection. Her mouth opened. 2 words came out. Not a whisper. Not tentative. "Senior Chief." The room went so quiet you could hear the building itself breathing. Danielle's hands trembled. Not from fear. From the weight of 20 years of carrying a name that wasn't hers, a rank that wasn't supposed to exist in this room, a past that was supposed to stay classified in a filing cabinet in Langley. She turned to see the girl still standing, one hand on the walker, her eyes locked on Danielle with the clarity of a child who had survived something that was supposed to be unsurvivable. Major Chen moved toward his daughter, but he was watching Danielle. His face was changing. Processing. Putting the timeline together. The way she had touched his daughter. The precision in her movements. The authority in her voice when she told people to get back. The way she had known exactly where to insert a needle to save a child's life in the dark. Danielle's eyes found the patient chart on the wall. It was automatic, reach for the data, read the admission summary, check the name. Her name. Her photograph. 20 years younger, in dress blues, standing rigid at attention, the kind of military bearing that never quite fades even when you're hiding it under scrubs and humility. Below the photograph, a list. Qualifications. Service record. Clearance level. And beneath all that, the notation that made her throat close, Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, Naval Special Warfare Command, retired 2004. Retired. Not disappeared. Retired. The doors opened. For men in dark windbreakers with SEAL team medallions on their chests. The team leader was maybe mid-50s, with a kind of face that had been in bad places and made decisions that couldn't be unmade. He came directly to Danielle and saluted, a full, sharp, fisted chest salute that turned every head in the ICU. Senior Chief. His voice like a tank idling in a garage, controlled, steady. Welcome home. The other 3 men took position around the room. The Afghan patient went still, recognizing the military bearing. Major Chen's hands dropped to his sides. The team leader continued. His words came in the precise cadence of official language. Bronze Star. Danielle heard it like a sentence being passed. Silver Star. Second Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Navy Cross for actions in Sangin Valley, October 2003, in defense of civilian casualties. Each medal sat in the air like its own echo. Each one was a piece of her that had been classified, redacted, filed away in a vault with no access buttons. Your mission was declassified 3 hours ago, the team leader said. Everything. Sangin. The clinic. The children. All of it. The president signed the papers this morning. Danielle didn't speak. There was nothing to say that was still classified, and everything else was already written on her face. Major Chen walked to her slowly. When he reached her, he extended his hand. She took it. His grip was the grip of a man who understood exactly what she had done and at what cost. "Thank you," he said. Behind them, the intercom crackled. Code blue in Trauma Bay 2. The sound pulled Danielle back to the present tense, to the ICU, to the fact that being declassified didn't actually change anything about how broken people still needed fixing. But before she could move toward the code, the conference room door opened. Agent Kowalski from the FBI, the one who had started this avalanche by showing up in the lobby. With her, a woman in a hospital security uniform and a man Danielle recognized from the IT department, Marcus Webb, who had worked here for 3 years and had never said anything about his own service until now. Dr. Hargrove attempted to delete security footage from the night of the code. Agent Kowalski said, "No preamble, no setup." He accessed the system at 2:13 p.m. using his administrative credentials. Mr. Webb's systems flagged the deletion and preserved the files in 3 separate locations. The footage is now in federal custody as evidence material related to classified personnel records. Danielle understood the architecture of what was happening. The boots had been found. The footprints matched. And now the person who had tried to erase them was being erased in return. Dr. Hargrove, somewhere in the hospital right now, was learning that he had broken a rule that transcended hospital policy. He had touched something that belonged to the government, and the government had a very long memory and very deep resources. 6 hours later, the hospital CEO suspended the termination hearing indefinitely. The investigation, she said, had entered a federal review phase. Dr. Hargrove's employment status was now under administrative review pending clearance completion. The language was corporate and careful, but what it meant was, we are stepping very far away from this situation. Danielle didn't attend the hearing. She was in Bay 7 with the Afghan patient, who had requested her specifically, who wanted to talk through an interpreter about the clinic and the boy who became a policeman and the 20-year gap between prayer and answer. Major Chen's daughter was in the hallway doing therapy, speaking in full sentences now, asking questions about everything. The neurons were reconnecting. The darkness was lifting. The sound of her voice, clear, present, alive, moved through the ICU like grace. 6 months passed in the architecture of normal time. Budgets were approved. New protocols were written. A veterans trauma program was funded on the 4th floor West Wing. The hospital board, it turned out, had been quietly looking for exactly this kind of program. They were simply waiting for the right person to lead it. Someone with both medical authority and something harder to quantify. Something like having already survived the unsurvivable. Dr. Hargrove's medical license went under review by the State Medical Board. His administrative case at the hospital concluded in termination for cause, destruction of evidence, violations of hospital policy, gross negligence in code response, and creating institutional liability. The board voted 7-1. He packed his office on a Tuesday afternoon. The nameplate came off the door before he reached the parking lot. 3 weeks later, he started teaching CPR fundamentals at Houston Community College, contract position, $18 per hour, exactly enough to cover an apartment and the kind of silence that comes when everyone stops returning your calls. Danielle's new office had windows. The 4th floor West Wing looked out over Houston's skyline, the kind of view that made clear days feel infinite and rain feel like the city itself was weeping. On the corner of her desk, exactly where patients could see it when they sat down, was a pair of worn combat boots. No longer hidden. No longer needing to hide. They were just boots now, evidence of something real. Major Chen's daughter came every Thursday for therapy, her voice getting stronger with each session. She asked Danielle why the boots were there, and Danielle picked them up, let the girl touch the leather worn soft by years of carrying weight, and said, "These remind me that some things are worth fighting for, even when people tell you to give up." The girl nodded with the gravity only traumatized children possess, understanding that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everyone together. Marcus Webb from IT installed the program's new secure communication system as a volunteer, no contract, no payment. He brought the specs himself and spent 2 weeks making sure every connection was bulletproof. Marine to Navy. Warrior to warrior. No ceremony required. That evening, Danielle drove home to her son, who now understood, at age 13, with the maturity that comes from watching your mother disappear and come back as something else. She told him what she could. He asked sometimes what it was like, and she told him what she knew, that service means staying in the room, that rank is less important than the decision to keep showing up, that some battles happen in deserts and some in hospitals, but the principles never change. She parked in the driveway. The silence of late afternoon. Through the window, she could see him at the kitchen table, homework spread out, waiting for her the way children wait when they understand that someone they love has been carrying something heavy. Her phone buzzed. A message from the SEAL team leader, training young corpsmen next month. Could use a guest lecturer on combat medicine. Interested? She typed, affirmative. She sat in the car for one more moment. The combat boots were on the living room shelf now, visible from the street if you knew what you were looking for. A reminder that some people carry their wars long after the shooting stops, and that the most important victories are won not in the dark but in rooms with monitors and heartbeats and terrified children whose silence can be broken by someone willing to stay when everyone else runs. She thought briefly of Dr. Hargrove, then released him back into the world where he belonged, the ordinary world of ordinary consequences. The real story wasn't about him anyway. The real story was 2 words whispered by a child who wasn't supposed to speak again. The real story was a hand held steady in the dark. The real story was that you do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You just need to understand what you're fighting for, and then refuse to look away. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Tell us in the comments, have you ever watched someone finally get recognized for who they really are? That's what we explore here. That's what matters. Every day. Thank you for staying in the room with us.